Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case will show that on May 1st, 2017, the defendant, Cheyanne Harris, received a blessing. Born to her was a son. That son was named Sterling Cohn. And you'll see Sterling Cohn through photographs that you received in evidence in this case. I'm showing you State's Exhibit number 96. This is a photograph taken of Sterling Cohn, the defendant's son. It was taken on July 15th, 2017 by that child's grandmother, Brandy Harris. You're going to hear from that child's grandmother that when Sterling was born and returned to the home where the defendant lived, that Sterling ate properly, Sterling was beginning to grow, and when she took this picture on July 15th, Sterling was just beginning to smile. Ladies and gentlemen, you'll hear in this case that the defendant, when she gave birth to Sterling, welcomed that child home to her family, to the residence that they shared in a little town in northeast Iowa in Chickasaw County called Alta Vista. Alta Vista, you'll hear in this case, is like a lot of small towns. It's a couple hundred people, and the defendant lived there in a small apartment. That apartment had 2 bedrooms, a living room, a bathroom, and a kitchen. And the evidence will show that the defendant welcomed this child into her home that she shared with her living boyfriend, Zachary, and another child, Nala, a little girl who was almost 2. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence will show in this case when the defendant received the blessing of that child, Sterling, little Sterling that was born to her, she also received a great responsibility. Sterling was as vulnerable as only a little baby could be. He was completely dependent on all of the caretakers in his life for all of his needs. Sterling couldn't feed himself. He couldn't regulate his temperature if he was hot or cold or needed a blanket or not. He couldn't change his diaper. He couldn't be sure that he was safe. He relied on the caretakers. He couldn't be sure he couldn't take care of his own medical needs. If he was ill, he relied on his parents for assistance to take care of him. Sterling was vulnerable as only a baby could be. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case will show that the defendant, that child's mother, Cheyanne Harris, failed in her responsibility as a parent. She failed little Sterling. She violated the trust that Sterling placed in her as her mother. And ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case will show by her actions, Sterling lost his life. Ladies and gentlemen, the actions of the defendant that you'll hear in this case will show that she placed little Sterling in the back bedroom of that 2-bedroom apartment in Alta Vista. She placed Sterling in a swing, one of those mechanical swings that swings back and forth, a baby swing. She placed that swing against the wall in a dark, unlit room that was hot and stuffy with no air movement because it was August. The windows were covered. And ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case will show that Sterling laid in that swing, he laid in that room in a diaper that hadn't been changed in as many as potentially 14 days. Somewhere between 9 and 14 days, his diaper hadn't been changed. The evidence will show that Sterling laid in that same diaper, filled with feces and soaked with urine, such that the feces attracted flies. They're called scuttle flies. They were attracted by the feces in his diaper. They laid eggs, those flies, in his diaper. And those eggs hatched into maggots, and the maggots began feeding on the contents of little Sterling's diaper. You're also going to hear evidence in this case that when he laid in that diaper in that room between 9 and 14 days, that little Sterling's skin under his diaper began to rupture, that the integrity of his skin was lost and began to slough off. And you're going to hear, ladies and gentlemen, that was because the contents of his diaper became like sewage. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case will show that little Sterling died of malnutrition. He weighed at the time of death under 7 pounds at almost 4 months of age. He was on the 5th percentile in the growth and weight chart, not where he was supposed to be. He died of malnutrition because he wasn't fed. He died of dehydration. And you'll see his body was dehydrated. The soft spot in his head was sunken in because he was dehydrated, because he did not receive fluids through formula or milk. He was dehydrated. And he also died, ladies and gentlemen, of diaper rash. Diaper rash. And I told you the evidence will show that his skin was ruptured and began to slough off. That allowed the bacteria that was in his feces, E. coli bacteria, to enter into his system, into his bloodstream, and cause an infection. Malnutrition, dehydration, infection caused by E. coli bacteria. That's what caused Sterling's death. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case will show that the defendant, Cheyanne Harris, was a stay-at-home mom, that she was in that apartment. Ladies and gentlemen, make no mistake, the evidence in this case will show that Sterling suffered in the last hours and days before his death. His body racked by fever from infection, with maggots feeding on his body's fluids, on the contents of his diaper, laying in urine and feces, soaked clothing. And at that time, his mother wasn't out of state. She wasn't across town. She was in the next room in that little apartment, ignoring his cries, ignoring his basic needs, ignoring her child, who lay in the swing, unloved, uncared for, and unaided by his mother. Ladies and gentlemen, the evidence in this case will show that her actions were unexcusable, and they rise to the level of murder in the first degree and child endangerment resulting in death. Ladies and gentlemen, this is not the time to talk about the law. At the conclusion of this case, the judge will tell you what the law is, and you'll have to follow that law. But suffice to say that under our law, felonious child endangerment under certain circumstances qualifies as murder in the first degree. So how are we going to prove in this case the defendant's actions? Ladies and gentlemen, you're going to hear that at about 12:55 p.m. on August 30th, 2017, the defendant's live-in boyfriend, the father of the child, placed a 911 call at 12:55 p.m. And in response, first responders and deputies went to the residence, and they're going to describe what they found. You're going to hear from Tony Friedrich, who was an EMT first responder, and she was at her home when she got the call, that there was an infant in distress. And of course, she rushed to the scene, rushed there thinking that she was going to be performing CPR or doing something to assist a child. And she kind of got lost, and she ran into a rural mail carrier, Tina Shotek, who directed her to the residence. You're going to hear from Miss Frederick and Miss Shotek as well, the mail carrier. Miss Frederick, the EMT, first responder, will describe when she went into the residence what she found. She'll describe going into that back bedroom where Miss Harris had left her baby Sterling. Miss Friedrich, the EMT, will talk about how the air in the room felt, what she smelled, what she saw. And she'll describe how she saw little Sterling in that swing facing the wall. And she'll describe how she reached out through his body to see if he had a pulse. And his little fists were clenched like this. And he was cold to the touch. And she knew then that there was nothing she could do to save Sterling. You're also going to hear from Deputy Jason Russell, who was the first deputy that went into that back room. And he went in the back room, and he'll describe what he saw. And he'll describe that he began to photograph the scene, and he began his investigation to make sure they preserved evidence. And ladies and gentlemen, he'll testify about how he saw little flies in the air, and how when he moved the blanket that was laid over the top of Sterling in the swing, he saw flies fly out of there. And ladies and gentlemen, I said you'll hear that Deputy Russell began the investigation because at that point, ladies and gentlemen, little Sterling Cohn's body was a crime scene. It was a crime scene. And you'll hear that little Sterling's body was taken to the Des Moines area, to the state medical examiner's office, so there could be an autopsy performed. You're going to hear from Dr. Dennis Klein. He's the Iowa State Medical Examiner. His job as a pathologist is to perform autopsies on people. And he'll describe to you that an autopsy, the purpose of it is to determine the cause of death and the manner of death. And he'll testify that the cause of Sterling's death was malnutrition, dehydration, and the E. coli bacteria, that diaper rash, and all of that together is denial of critical care. That was the cause of death. He'll also testify that the manner of death was homicide. It was homicide. You're also going to hear, ladies and gentlemen, that during the autopsy, Dr. Klein preserved by photographs as well as taking samples some of those insects that he found. And you're going to hear why he did that. And you're going to hear that he sent those samples and those photographs to somebody named Dr. Tim Huntington. And Dr. Huntington is going to testify in this case. He's what's called a forensic entomologist. Entomology is the study of insects. And Dr. Huntington is going to testify, and he's a professor of entomology and biological science at a college out in Nebraska, okay? And he's board certified, and he'll talk about that. And he's going to tell you that in this case, he identified the insects that were found on Sterling's body as scuttleflies. And he'll describe the scuttlefly as a fly that's common in our homes here in Iowa. In fact, you might see them, they're like little gnats. You might see them around bananas or fruit that you have out on the counter. And that their life cycle is very well studied. There's been a lot of scientific study of their life cycle. And you're going to hear from Dr. Huntington, the evidence will show that he was able to examine, because the life cycle of a scuttlefly is very well understood, he examined the insect evidence taken from Sterling's body, and he was able to conclude that Sterling had laid in that same diaper for between 9 and 14 days. And the way he was able to do that is he'll describe how scuttleflies are attracted to a food source, in this case the contents of Sterling's diaper. They lay an egg, it hatches into a maggot, the maggot feeds, and eventually goes into like a little cocoon phase before it enters as a fly. And he'll be able to explain what he found and how he was able to conclude, that the diaper had been on the child for between 9 and 14 days. Ladies and gentlemen, you're also going to hear in this case that this is not a case where the parent, Ms. Harris, lacked resources or was an inexperienced parent. You're going to hear, ladies and gentlemen, that her live-in boyfriend, Mr. Cohn, he had a full-time job. He worked at a trucking company, and he earned a salary of $45,000 per year. You're also going to hear, ladies and gentlemen, that other child in the home, her name is Nala. She was only almost 2 years old. The evidence will show that she was healthy, in contrast to Sterling. In contrast to Sterling, she was properly clothed and clean and bathed. She was properly fed. In fact, some of the witnesses might describe her as chubby or chunky. She was properly in a proper bed, with proper blankets, in contrast to Sterling. This is not a case where the defendant lacked the ability to properly care for a child. Ladies and gentlemen, at its heart, the evidence will show that this case is about actions and consequences. Actions and consequences. The actions of the defendant in this case directly caused the death of her child, Sterling home. That was the consequences. The consequences of her actions is that the defendant is guilty of the crime of murder in the first degree and guilty of the crime of child endangerment resulting in death. And at the conclusion of the case, the state will stand up before you again and ask you to find her guilty of those charges. Thank you.